Well, I'm Kay Barnett, and I became active in the EIS way back in 1980, 43 years ago, but eventually became national president in 2010-11.
And I'm Jack Barnett. I became really involved with EIS after the strikes in the 1980s and eventually became EIS president in 2005-2006.
I'm Dave McGinty. I'm a national officer with the EIS.
My name is Margaret Smith. I'm an ex-president of the EIS.
Hello, I'm John Patton. As you can tell from my vowel sounds, I'm Irish. I came to speak in Stirling University in 1969. I met a girl there, and 2 years later we were married and we came to live in Edinburgh. Is that enough?
My name's Pam Loudon. I was in the EIS for almost the moment I put a foot inside a school.
My name's Ian Loudon. I, like Pam, was an EIS member until I retired. We feel a bit like these people you see sometimes on breakfast TV, the old-timers who were fought in World War II, who come onto the set with their medals and such like. This is the memories of us of 40 years ago in the industrial accident.
I'm Annie McRae. I think it'd be true to say I was a frequent speaker and rabble-rouser at AGMs. Lots of the campaigns I was very much at the heart of. And so I think my memories of the 1980s campaign, I'm also very well aware of the similarities, but also the kind of development of different campaigns and the different arguments that were involved in them.
I think my overwhelming memory is of the solidarity of the EIS members at that time. And given that it was a dispute which lasted for the best part of 2 years, it was quite remarkable that there weren't any divisions or splits within the union over what was happening.
I think it was interesting in that nobody wanted to go on strike, but that was a marker of how committed Scottish teachers were to learners and to education in general. There was a feeling, not just at the marches, not just at rallies, but in your day-to-day teaching life, that you were part of a teaching community that was a trade union. And that was a very difficult issue in those days for some teachers. And indeed, we are still a professional association, we're still the EIS. But in the 80s, we became a fully fledged trade union.
It was a just campaign. It galvanised the teaching profession. It was very, very necessary because there had been erosion of pay since Clegg in 1980 through to 1984 when the campaign started.
So there was a great sense of we were doing something right for ourselves, for our colleagues, for the youngsters we taught, and we felt we were asking for something that was reasonable.
It was a long, drawn-out process. I've got to remember at that time it was a Conservative government in Westminster. This was pre-Scottish Parliament days. And I do remember the intransigence of the Conservative government in London. At the time, Mrs Thatcher was in charge and her Secretary of State for Scotland was George Younger, and he was adamant that he wasn't going to give teachers what he called a blank cheque.
Strikes were very efficiently organised. It had the support of all the teachers in my school. It had the support of families, which is always crucial to strike action. Teachers' industrial action without the support of families is a very sticky ground to be on. And indeed I can recall going to a strike meeting in Falkirk, a parade, a demonstration with my 3 school-aged children carrying placards, support the teachers, and my mum was starving.
I suppose a lot of people, when they talk about the 1980s strike action, they'll remember the strikes. But actually there was a really long run before we even got to strike action. So the ballot took place in the early winter of 1985, and there was an 85% turnout, I think, for that ballot. And I remember actually as a rep going around the school collecting ballots in from individual members to make sure that they'd voted. And we got a 75% nationally vote in favour of taking action. And the very first day of strike action was on the 5th of December in 1985. A dark, cold December morning, we had a picket line. It seemed like a small thing, this wee group of people standing outside your school, your workplace, on a December morning, but the buzz that we were actually now doing something, and wow, what a buzz. And we carried that buzz on when we went to the big rally which was taking place in the city that day. And there were various speakers, but John Pollock in particular was the standout, the General Secretary, and he said something along the lines of, "We have no alternative, we have to fight. If we didn't, we would be condemned by history. And if you're teachers and you're taking strike action, you're not just doing it for yourselves, you're doing it for an improvement in schools, an improvement for young people in Scotland." And that's what it was about.
There are 175 teachers crammed into the Contour Arms Hotel in Inverurie on a cold Thursday night to hear the General Secretary of the EIS address. And we had a march and rally in Aberdeen. He held, like 3,000 teachers basically in the palm of his hand. He was a great orator and an inspirational speaker.
Why I took part was because people who had been teachers before had won so many things for us, so we had to fight to gain things for those coming behind. And I think what we had to get across to parents was that the Saturday football, the Saturday hockey, the Friday night swimming galas, anything that teachers were doing out with school was not getting paid for. They were under the impression that teachers were paid a vast sum of money for doing a job that was only 9 till 3. You had long holidays. Getting that message across, I think, helped to get parents on side. And I just felt that it was for the greater good of teaching.
Well, what we were fighting for, I suppose, factually, was an independent pay review, and to try and make sure that we didn't have to keep reinventing the wheel every year, and we have to struggle with that and fight with that and debate it. So this was an idea to make sure that teachers were paid properly. The action went on for a long, long time. But it was also in the context of the miners' strike that was going on at the same time, and that was hugely disturbing. I mean, the miners were treated shockingly. But I suppose made us think about what we were there to do as trade unionists as well. So that was something else that was in the mix, that we weren't exactly fighting for them, but we were fighting, in a sense, shoulder to shoulder with them.
One, I was a classroom teacher, unpromoted, the sole breadwinner in the house, and I hadn't reached the top of the scale, although I had been teaching at that time about 14 years. There were pressing economic reasons for me to be disenchanted with the job and with the rewards that I was getting for a job that I enjoyed and which, if it doesn't sound too egotistical, I regarded myself as pretty good at as well. The workload was growing and growing and growing, and the amount of money available for resources was shrinking. I could see what was happening in schools was not in the interests of teachers, not in the interests of parents, and certainly not in the interests of pupils.
What you've got to remember is that this was 1984 to 1986. You didn't have email, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have a mobile phone, or if you did, it came in the size of a suitcase. So we were very much reliant on communications from EIS headquarters. They were quite rigorous in their communication strategy. We commissioned Malky McCormack as a cartoonist, and that kind of humour kept things going.
When certain politicians who'd been very much against the EIS and the teachers' action realised that parents and public were starting to say, this is going on for a long time, we care about our children's education, we care about Scottish education, you do something about it. And when you began to see more and more teachers in your own school or across Scotland becoming involved, you began to see this is the powerful voice of reasonable professional teachers growing, and that is really good for morale.
in my school, everyone, apart from one person, was very, very supportive of what the EIS was trying to do. And I think the EIS holding mass rallies at various points, Glasgow, Edinburgh and elsewhere, Ayr was a big one in Ayr, George Younger's constituency. That helped people across the country, teachers across the country, to realise that we're all in this together.
I think too the rallies were fun. We were young and under a lot of stress, and they were good fun. I mean, for example, at one point the Secretary of State offered us, I think it was 10% over 5 years, and the great rallying cry at the rallies was, what do we want? 2%. When do we want it? 1990, and a great humour and fun there, which helped to boost morale too.
About 1983-84, you began to detect in the editorials these people were being given stories from government that there was a softening of the approach. Now, I understand, and I have no evidence of this, I have to say, but I understand that Thatcher at one time was intent on brazening it out. She had beaten the miners and she was up for the fight again. But her Secretary of State in Scotland at that time was George Younger. Younger was a wise old bird, and I think he said to her, look, Margaret, don't take these people on. That's a very, very different case from taking on the miners. Every single village in Scotland is affected. Every town in Scotland, every city in Scotland, every home in Scotland has some connection with the teachers' industrial action. And you'll be taking on more than the EIS and the SSTA. You'll be taking on a whole country. Don't do it.
I think the fundamental change was when George Younger was moved within Cabinet, and all of a sudden a new face came in, Malcolm Rifkin. Malcolm Rifkin's a Tory, but he was a much more amenable to listening to what the teachers had said, and I think the EIS realised this from being months and months and months of nothing really happening in terms of what the government response was. All of a sudden, within weeks basically, the main commission for looking at teachers' salaries and conditions was implemented, and the strikes came to a halt.
Agreement on the main report was finally reached in January 1987, and SE40 was what ensued from that. I think there are actually quite a lot of similarities between the latest and most recent EIS Pay Attention campaign and the 1980s campaign. I think for a start, the context of austerity, rising cost of living and so on, very similar to what we were facing in the 1980s. So that bit, and if you like, the pressure to do something. I think as well that the kind of tactics that have been used are interestingly similar. The use of the targeted action, the political constituencies, has been lifted straight out of the 1980s rulebook of how that campaign was organised.
As the industrial action has gone on, the support from parents and the public has been positive in comparison to what some may have expected, and that was the same in the 80s. I think it's been such a collective experience.
I've been out in the picket line, and the morale, that similarities there. People are together. You know, that they are fighting for the one thing. There was a bond.
I think as well, now that the campaign has come to an end, I think it's true that we came out of the 1980s action in some ways as a union organisationally stronger. We might not have won a perfect deal. It's not perfect. On the other hand, the union is almost stronger, got a bigger membership, and in terms of workplace organisation, level of representation and so on, it's phenomenal. And I think perhaps that was also what happened after our action in the 1980s.
I mean, unfortunately, there are similarities which we do not welcome, that the problems really remain very similar to what they were back in the 80s. The current dispute, of course, has been about pay and conditions of service and workload. And those are the issues which continually reappear on the horizon because they haven't been given some kind of long-term solution. I suppose the positive thing about it, or the positive similarity, is in the the strength of teachers and the strength of the EIS in supporting teachers and the vision for education, which hasn't changed since the 1980s or the 1970s, and I'm sure before the 1970s, which has always been that we want a top quality education system in Scotland, and it should be properly resourced in order to provide that. And that is something which shines through still, and I'm pleased to say that.